We're now going to do a session with a very provocative title. Luckily, we have an excellent panel with experts really from a variety of different disciplines and countries to help us to address the issue. A new European world order. Yes?
Maybe he can sit a few minutes there, we cannot see them.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, all right. We're just going to allow the minister so we have a good view. The minister can join us. No, as I was thinking about today's panel, I was reminded that there are definitely certain times in history when one needs to take a moment and reflect. Are paradigms changing? Is the situation or the context the same as we try to find solutions and answers to the pending questions? And the first moment I was thinking of was actually the September 11th attacks in New York. And at that time, Walter Lecoeur, who's actually a terrorism expert in the United States, at the time he was the co-chair of the International Research Council at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, made a reflection on sort of the changing paradigm of the world after September 11th. He said the following: "Far from being on the verge of a new order, the world has entered a period of great disorder. In facing these new dangers, a re-examination of old priorities is needed. Cultural diplomacy, in the widest sense, has increased in importance, whereas traditional diplomacy and military power are of limited use in coping with most of these dangers." Now, as the director and founder of the Academy for Cultural Diplomacy in Berlin, of course, that was an important quote for us to see how cultural diplomacy can be useful after such a terrible tragedy. Today, of course, I would argue the situation is even more complex, where the threats are far greater and even more urgent, as we address today with the issues of Russia, Ukraine, Middle East, the list goes on and on. So the topic that we have today, I've asked actually the former Taoiseach of Ireland, also a long-time board member of the Academy, Bertie Ahern, to begin with some opening comments on this complex topic. I'll read it out loud, and then maybe we can give a warm welcome to Mr. Bertie Ahern and the panelists. "The world's leading economy will lead the free world with democratic values, armed forces, satellites, value-based social media, and AI. Let us please give a warm welcome to the Honourable Mr. Bertie Ahern."
Thanks very much, Mark, and it's good to be in Berlin and good to be with you as a mediator. I know you spent a lifetime thinking on cultural diplomacy. But just before, at the lunchtime, we got tied for time, so with President Clinton and Secretary Clinton coming in. So just a few remarks that I wanted to just generally make. I think, as you have said, I guess we gather here, the challenges seem far more significant than when you and I were dealing with some of these issues 10, 15 years ago in terms of conflict and climate change and food security and so many vulnerable issues for the planet. And I think in an increasing number of cases, societies are faced with the problem of making democratic participation more relevant to a new generation who appear to be increasingly disenchanted with long-established methods of governance and that seem to offer long-term solutions to what many see as immediate problems in the short term. We're just outside at lunchtime to see about 3 protests on the street here on different international issues and people having their say. But I think that the world of political leadership is a vastly different landscape than when I entered politics. And I think when I was in government in the 80s and 90s, things have changed so much, and I suppose the advent of the 24-hour news, the need to fill dedicated channels with a constant flow of news and information that brought people's attentions almost immediately, or at least if you're beside the television screen. But today, in the age of, which we're going to talk about, artificial intelligence and moving on from the smartphone and all of the other things, it's just political reaction is a requirement that is instant, and it's just so different. Just a few points I want to make. Democracy is both a deliberative and participative exercise for societies, and it's deliberative in the public debate that it can create the opportunity to consider courses of action on economic and social changes in the medium and long term. And I think it's participative in that it encourages people to come forward to contribute solutions to public challenges, in the spirit of public service, which is what you and I were talking about over the years in cultural diplomacy, because you're attracting people in that were not in the normal political landscape. And I think one of the impacts of media, and in particular social media, over the past decade and a half has been the development of myths that problems can be expressed simply and succinctly in a few short sentences. Then there must be equally simple and ready solutions to these problems. And the other impact of all of this noise against which political decisions must be taken is it's limited the space where we can attract different views and individuals who can balance political debate and give a sense of democratic participation. And that's a worthwhile pursuit towards making it better for society. So, in short, Mark, just in opening, I think many capable and accomplished people would probably think twice before offering themselves as candidates for public office. And this is a problem all over the place. And when people are honest, and when I meet leaders in other places, people are turning away, and it's finding it far harder to get people into it. And as a country that's had our democracy for over 100 years, we're the 15th longest now, even though we're only 100 years in Ireland. So it's amazing how changes are going. But I think we're in a very, as I think you saw at the opening debate today, we're in a very worrying part. I mean, autocracy is growing rapidly, democracy is declining nearly as rapidly, and I think the space that you and Bernaston were talking about for a long way back on cultural diplomacy is probably becoming more relevant and important than it was even when we were at it back a decade ago.
Thank you very much. I thought that was an excellent and insightful way of beginning the discussion. We're very honored now to have a distinguished guest joining us from Canada. And thank you so much for making the effort also to connect to us virtually. Ladies and gentlemen, the next keynote speaker on the panel was the Minister of Emergency Preparedness from 2023 until 2025, Minister responsible for the Pacific Economic Development Agency of Canada from 2001 to 2025, Minister of International Development from 2021 to 2023, and Minister of National Defense, 2015 to 2021. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome for the Honourable Mr. Harjit Sajjan.
Good morning, good afternoon, all of you. Can everyone hear me fine?
Yes.
Good. First of all, I'll just have some prepared remarks as well, if you don't mind, and I'll share some of my thoughts as well. First of all, I just want to take the opportunity for thank the World Forum organizer for inviting me to participate in this event. I apologize I couldn't be there in person, but as some of you may know that I won't be seeking re-election, so it was important for me to transition my portfolios to the new ministers as well, and that just literally just happened a couple of days ago. You know, this topic is extremely relevant, and I can say throughout my career, whether I was in my early days in the police dealing with organized crime, whether serving in Bosnia or Afghanistan in the military, or leading my various ministries when I became a member of Parliament. I mean, I've led national defense for almost 6 years, international development, which is so important for conflict prevention, and also my most recent portfolio that I had was emergency preparedness, and with all the crises that we've had and emergencies, not only here in Canada but around the world. But I've also reflected on one key central question: well, what is peace and security, and what do they mean, especially in our current context? So anyone who knows me, I've literally focused on my work on one key framework, which is prevention. If I've been in a conflict, how could this conflict have been prevented? Now, given the current state of affairs, the adage, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail, has never run truer. That is, peace, safety, and security, our democracy are not naturally occurring phenomena. They have not been born, especially out of thin air, and they were created through sacrifice and our collective will to build and nurture a peaceful way of life with universal understandings of rules and laws. But especially today, they remain pretty fragile and unevenly distributed, and especially they're increasingly at risk. And most recently, our former Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, visited Ukraine to mark the solemn third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. And I visited Ukraine numerous times from 2016 to 2022, and I had the privilege to witness the resilience of Ukrainian people. And I focused on revamping our training mission there in the early days to help Ukraine modernize and prepare for the horrible full-scale invasion that Putin inflicted. And I want to take this opportunity to commend the Ukrainian people and who are fighting tirelessly for their freedom, justice, and also their democracy. But this is not the Ukraine fight alone. All around the world, communities are grappling with the simultaneous crises, conflict, climate-induced disasters, shrinking economies, political instability, terrorism, social divisions, and ever-rising cost of living that also creates a lot of these problems. These crises demand not only an urgent response, but also bold leadership. Leadership that's willing to find pathways to prevent these challenges from becoming entrenched. And we need to figure out, especially with the new age of AI and mis and disinformation. So preventing the failure of peace and democracy is not something that one person, one community, or even one nation can do alone. We need a collective approach, one built on shared principles and a collective strength to reinforce them. Now, this may seem hopeful or even sometimes naive, but when we consider the state of the world that we have today, let me remind you that we have done this before. Back in 1920, nations came together to form the League of Nations, and when that effort failed in 1945, nations came together again to create the United Nations. The UN has since led vital initiatives, especially the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a blueprint for world peace, prosperity, and justice. And is it perfect? Absolutely not. But to do nothing is not an option that we can afford. And here, I'm proud to say that since 2015, Canada has worked hard to help lift the most vulnerable out of poverty, working with very close partners in Europe to make life more affordable for people around the world, to tackle climate change, and to grow our economy that benefits everyone while fulfilling a role in making the world better, not just for a few, within our borders and also outside as well. But we know that more must be done, and we know that this work must be done together. So let me circle back to my original point of prevention. If we are to prevent a future where our children and their children inherit endless cycles of war, conflict, climate crises, injustice, we must begin with a clear, unified goal to work together in an allyship solidarity if we want to prevent these. I admit that in many of these spaces that I've worked in, the word solidarity was not often considered. In today's geopolitical climate, I ask everyone to consider that solidarity for like-minded individuals. We have to make sure that solidarity is for our neighbors, our communities, and within our own borders. And we cannot afford to ignore the fact that we face collective challenges. Now, crises are intensifying and affecting nations across the globe. Simultaneously, we face political, health, other global challenges, and it is imperative that we work together, not just as individuals or isolated nations, but also as collective, but a collective for peace, security, and for justice. Now, these may be just buzzwords to some, but this is something that we must strive for. Crises do not recognize borders, nor should our response. Through international collaboration, that we can share knowledge, leverage resources, foster innovation, innovative solutions that protect the most vulnerable amongst us, our global citizens across the world. And I can say with confidence that Canada and Canadians stand ready to collaborate with our global partners in the fight against the threats to peace and democracy. We are committed to sharing knowledge, learning from others, and work side by side to build a peaceful and more resilient environment. Now, as you leave, and we leave this forum today, I urge all of us to do so with a renewed sense of purpose and a collective commitment to act now. Now, together we have the tools, the knowledge, most importantly, the will to make lasting impacts. So we need to be able to seize the moment, even with the challenges that we see today to our south, our closest partner, the U.S. We see the challenges that are taking place. We see the challenges with the technology that at one point can actually benefit our society, and at the same time create a lot of instability with this information that's there. So we need to be able to still look back, work together to making sure, because like I said, the option to ignore this is at our own peril. I look forward to listening to all of you and hearing the collective voices to find the solutions that we need to work for. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is actually coming from a framework some would say would be hard power, as opposed to the soft power Joseph Nye refers to, or as Dr. Ahern was talking about, cultural diplomacy. But coming from this background of hard power, I think you're very, very qualified as a result of that to speak about soft power, cultural diplomacy, and the topic of today's discussion, the new European world order. Our next speaker served in the United States Army Europe, Allied Land Command in wars in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. So has a lot of experience really seeing this from the point of view of Europe as well as around the world. Please join me in a very warm welcome for the Honorable Lieutenant General Ben Hodges.
To be clear, I never fought in a war in Pakistan. I mean, this, just to make sure nobody's looking for me, okay? We fought in, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, but not Pakistan. But it's interesting you mentioned that, because it's almost impossible to separate Pakistan from Afghanistan. I mean, obviously they share a border, but Pakistan also shares a border with India. And I've often been asked, what happened in Afghanistan? I mean, 20 years, $2 trillion, thousands of people, service members killed, and tens of thousands of civilians, and we failed. Why did we fail? And I think there's some things that we did wrong there that should be taken into consideration as we look at what does a European security order look like. First of all, our leaders have to speak to us as adults. Explain why we have to do something. Not a pep talk, not about patriotism, but why is it in our interest to participate in or to go into a conflict. That never happened when it came to Afghanistan. It was all about immediate reaction to the attacks from 9/11, which were reasonable, and in fact, for the only time in its history, NATO invoked Article 5. All of our allies came to our support after the United States was attacked on 9/11, and so an operation was launched quickly into Afghanistan to make sure that Afghanistan could never be a base for training or launching attacks against the United States or our allies. And all of NATO agreed and supported that, which is frankly often forgotten in the United States. And so if the president had just said, we're going in there, we're going to make sure that this cannot be a base again, and then we're out. We're not going to turn Afghanistan into Switzerland. We're going to go in there and make sure that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda could never launch attacks against us again from there. Instead, we only had a clearly defined mission that first year. For the next 19 years, we did not have a clearly defined strategic objective. Now, I have a daughter and a granddaughter. I'm all for women going to school, but that was not the reason we went to Afghanistan. That became an excuse to stay in Afghanistan later, but that was not the reason for going to Afghanistan. And so we ended up putting money and people into something that never was clearly defined for our objective. So for me, that was the biggest takeaway. We lost sight of the mission, just like we lost sight of the mission in Ukraine. My president, President Biden, who I was proud of what he did to help Ukraine, he never explained why it was important for the United States. And so because of that, too many people could be easily distracted and say, yeah, bad luck for Ukrainians, but we need money too. And so again, I keep going back to the importance of the strategic objective, whatever it is we're talking about. And that's the hardest thing to do, to clearly define an objective and explain it to your population as if they were adults and why it mattered. The second thing that we failed at was connected. It was not one American paid a special tax for the war in Afghanistan. In other words, the war was paid for with special funds that just added to the debt. There was no specific tax. Now, why does that matter? Obviously, it matters because it added enormously to the debt, about $2 trillion for the United States. But also, it allowed the American people to disconnect from it. I mean, unless you had a family member that was in the service or that was a diplomat, or unless you live next to a big Army base or a Marine base, it didn't affect you. I mean, after about the second or third year, you would never find anything about Afghanistan in the Washington Post or the New York Times or whatever your local paper was, unless there was, 8 soldiers killed in a terrible whatever. So for 20 years, pretty much, the American people were disconnected from what was happening. And so that means there was no pressure on any president. And we had 4 presidents: Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. And over 20 years, that's about 10 different Congresses that never put pressure on us to get the strategy right. So, as I think about the purpose of our panel here and the topic, getting the objective right, explaining it to the people, and making sure that the population is involved. I'm not talking about a universal draft, although I'm not against that, but at least people should pay for it, so that at some point when families are reviewing their finances, and I can imagine a head of a family saying, what the hell, we're still in Afghanistan? I'm still paying for that? And that leads to pressure on the government to do something. So that, for me, was a huge takeaway. The other 2 are more specific to the situation, but still relevant to other security issues involving Europe. We talked about Afghanistan as if it was an island. But of course, as we started off with, Afghanistan had Iran on one side, and it had Pakistan and India on the other side, and then I think Tajikistan in the north. But we always talked about it like it was an island. And in fact, you may know that the U.S., how we kind of organize ourselves around the world with regional combatant commands. So U.S. Central Command is the command responsible for everything in the Middle East. U.S. Indo-Pacific Command is responsible for obviously everything out in the India and the Pacific. So that means we had a boundary between 2 different headquarters that was on the border between India and Pakistan. Now that affects how you think about things. How can you think about Pakistan without thinking about India, and vice versa? So we organized ourselves incorrectly, and we didn't have a regional approach to how we thought we were going to help protect the population inside of Afghanistan. And then the final thing that I think also still has relevance, because the big debate today, right down the street in the Bundestag, is, German defense investment growing. Hopefully this is going to be approved. It was approved. Very good. So that's breaking news. And so how do we help other countries with their defense, like Ukraine? In Afghanistan, we built a very good Afghan security force. It was very good, and it was huge. It dwarfed the Taliban. Dwarfed them in size and in weapons and capability, and yet it collapsed in just a few weeks. Why is that? Because we built an Afghan army that looked exactly like us, which is great as long as you have thousands of contractors, endless amounts of logistics, endless amounts of ammunition, endless amounts of intelligence. Then that's the right model. Well, when we took away those things as part of the drawdown, then this Afghan army and Afghan police force collapsed. It wasn't because they weren't courageous, it was because they were not properly organized. And so that was our fault. We created an army that was not connected to Afghan culture, that would represent or would have that affiliation. The best Afghan army unit I ever saw looked exactly like Taliban. They rode around in the back of a pickup truck, and they had a U.S. Army Special Forces lieutenant colonel that was in charge of it. These guys were devastating, but they knew what they were looking for. So the connection to a new European security is our leaders have to talk to us like we are adults. We have to make sure that taxpayers are involved. Don't tell them, don't you worry about these troops that are over here fighting somewhere. You keep going to holidays and shopping. Don't be distracted by this. And then we have to make sure we understand the geography and the culture of the region we're in. And that goes whether we're talking about Afghanistan, Iraq, or Ukraine. We keep talking about Ukraine as if it's an island, but it's a part of Europe on the Black Sea, which is a region that is extremely important for hundreds of millions of people. And I don't think we've approached the problem that way.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker considers himself having equally not only a German citizen, but a European. In your career, I think also in your personal life. Happy to say you had the chance to work with my sister. She was Assistant Secretary of State for Joe Biden, Karen Donfried. This is the first time we've had a chance to work together, so I'm looking forward to that. The State Secretary from the Federal Ministry of Finance, who has had extensive experience in the German Foreign Ministry and beyond. Perfect match for this panel to discuss with us the new European world order. Please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Heiko Thomas.
Yeah, well, thank you for the warm welcome. Well, the topic today is a new order for Europe. And forgive me if I speak a little bit about this from the German perspective, but it is, of course, momentous historic day. Maybe we should use that term sparsely, but it is, I believe. And I notice it is because I talked earlier, just met Ibrahim from the Maldives, sitting in the audience here, whose first question was about the German debt brake. So if this is of interest in the Maldives, it probably has global implications. And as you've just heard 10 minutes ago, the decision was taken to adapt, to change our constitutional debt brake, which I wouldn't have seen coming only 4 weeks ago, the way it was done. This, of course, will create a new reality for us here. I don't know if you're all familiar with what has been decided. We will exempt all defense spending above 1 percentage point of GDP from our debt brake, would exempt the lender to a certain extent from the debt brake, and we'll be creating a new infrastructure fund worth 500 billion euros over the next 12 years. That sounds like a lot of money. It probably is a lot of money. Just to put this in perspective, as you said, I was formerly a diplomat, now I'm Minister of Finance. This, of course, will be built up over time. This is not money that's going to be spent tomorrow morning. There's a medium to long-term planning horizon on this. So what will this money do? It will, of course, help us to build up the Bundeswehr in the way it should have been built up a long time ago. It will help us to address public infrastructure issues, like the train system or the bridges. It may help us a little bit with the digitalization of our public administration, where there's a lot we can do. It will also help us in parts of our energy problems that we are faced with, because we need we need energy at competitive prices, and we need a new grid, but it will not help us with the structural slump our private sector is in. So some of the issues we are faced with are clearly structural, so what we also need to address, and that can't be done with money, that is to reduce red tape, bureaucracy, the overregulation that we are being faced with, and what we also somehow need to cope with, and there I see actually the biggest issue, and that goes back again also to our military planning. That's our demographic situation in Germany, because I think the big bottleneck in the years to come will actually be the lack of skilled labor, and not even only skilled labor. I mean, all levels of the workforce will be affected by the demographic trend. And I'm sometimes surprised, I have to say, about the way we talk about migration here. Of course, illegal migration needs to be addressed. It is an issue. Crime is an issue. But what we need first and foremost is, of course, more migration, more skilled labor, people coming in the system that even affects all levels of government. We talk about reintroduction of conscription in Germany, and that may solve some of the personnel issues we're being faced with the German Bundeswehr, but conscription will not help you to find pilots. It will not help you to find engineers. It will not help you to find the managers we also need in the German army. So these are big issues that we now need to address. US. This is something that affects the Bundeswehr, but also affects the private sector. And now we need to come from talk to action. We have provided the funds, but of course the doing now will be the important aspect. And of course, what we need to do is to do this also together as Europeans. I mean, you were at NATO, I was at NATO formally between 2017 and 2020. Even at the time, and that was the time of the first Trump administration, would not have imagined a situation like the one we're in now. NATO is only about one thing. NATO is about trust. It's about trust in Article 5. This trust has been shaken, to put it mildly, and this is not easy to be restored. So one way or the other, we need to get stronger as Europeans, because it's the right thing to do anyways. If we become stronger, we'll be a more attractive partner to the United States of America. If the United States of America is still not interested, then we need to be strong on our own. So it's the right decision, no matter what. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Rick. As you saw, we purposely tried to build this panel really interdisciplinary. Our next speaker is coming from the private sector, is the CEO, CTO at Element, Project Lead Matrix. And maybe you could also tell us a few words about what you do as well. Please a warm welcome to Mr. Matthew Hodgson.
Thanks, everybody. Is this on? There we go. Yeah, I may be the odd one out here in terms of coming from the private sector. And however, my perspective on the new European order is probably quite relevant, because what we do at Element and Matrix is to provide communication infrastructure that people can run themselves with digital sovereignty. Because I think the elephant in the room here is that today, the actual technology that you would use to run a new world order is almost entirely American. And that's nothing at all against America. There's amazing technology there. However, as a sovereign nation, does it really make sense to be operationally dependent on any other sovereign nation for your core infrastructure? And I would argue that it's almost a contradiction in terms. However, the reality is that unfortunately across Europe, there isn't that much today of a competition to provide equivalent capabilities. So for instance, you may guess I'm from the UK based on my accent, and the British government seems to be using Teams everywhere to communicate, which is run entirely out of the US. We saw a few days ago the Swedish military recommending that people use Signal to communicate, which again is a US-based platform. So what we have Element is basically the ability to run your own Signal-style or WhatsApp-style communication capability, but entirely with your own digital sovereignty. Our first country was France. We picked this up about 6 years ago, rolled it out across all of the 17 ministries on a system called Chat. They were very rapidly followed by the Bundeswehr, who then rolled it out as BV Messenger, and now more recently Bundesmessenger in Germany. Then it turned out that Ukraine had an urgent requirement to control their own communication for obvious reasons, and so picked this up and started using it themselves. Now, the interesting characteristic here of how we've gone about this is that the technology is open source. Anybody can pick it up and run it themselves, which poses a whole set of other interesting problems, but it basically allows the intrinsically decentralized nature of Europe, and indeed all the countries around the world, to run it as equals. It is intrinsically multilateral. We kind of position the underlying technology matrix as the missing communication layer of the web, and it's relevant in terms of responsible social media and values-based social media, which I think was one of the topics here for the panel that we haven't really touched on yet, in terms of basically empowering people to control how they communicate. Because the reality is that the bad guys, the authoritarian states here, don't need to worry about some coordination between lots of different countries. By definition, it's top down, and if the dictator in charge says, hey everybody, today we're going to use this system that we run, everybody get on it right now, you don't need to worry about any coordination or any multilaterality, or are you dependent on a single country for the tech. So we have just a very practical problem right now, that if the West needs to collaborate en masse urgently, the infrastructure in some ways is not there at a technological level. We're obviously trying to fix that as rapidly as possible, but I think it's critical for Germany, for instance, with the new funding, to route some of that into Zendis. Anybody heard of Zendis? So this is a new agency in Germany which stands for the Centre of Digital Sovereignty that has been set up about a year and a half ago and is specifically about building out open source infrastructure so that one can run a Teams style experience or a Microsoft 365 style experience without being dependent on Microsoft. And Germany is very much leading the way on this, but Sweden is getting involved as well, France, the Netherlands, maybe the UK will wake up and get involved as well. And I think it's an interesting direction of travel right now, and I would urge everybody here who represents the country to have a long, serious think, including the US, I should say, about running their own infrastructure. And ironically, we do talk a lot to the federal government, where the concern, frankly, is the risks of being dependent on Silicon Valley. So I can't say which branches of the government we talk to, but frankly, the concern of being beholden to Silicon Valley there is about as large as the concern of, say, Europe being also dependent on Silicon Valley. So I appreciate this may be slightly out of context with the rest of the stories here, but I would urge everybody to think strongly about the practicalities of how this new world or new European order would operate.
Thank you very much. I'd like to stay with the British perspectives and introduce a member of the Parliament from the United Kingdom who's joining us, the Honourable Mr. Chris Law.
Thank you. I think with all discussions, it's always a bit worrying if you're near the end because you might not have much to say, but actually, listening to what we're all saying here, and we're talking about relationships. And in fact, the last time I was in Berlin was last autumn, and I came over to meet with the British ambassador. And we're here to discuss through the friendship group, the cross-party friendship group in the UK with Germany, and to look at what strategic partnerships will come out of the end up being in the EU. I'll come back to that in a second. But between the UK and Germany. And I remember the time it felt stilted. Partly stilted because we're not in the EU, and partly because when leaving the EU, the UK government at the time, the Conservative government, didn't build up those relationships that we had been building up for decades, frankly, as part of the EU. As a member of Parliament from Scotland, if you can guess by now with the accent, there was a Brexit referendum in 2016, and 62% of people in Scotland voted to remain. That was not the same across the rest of the UK, so we have a divergence. Scotland sees itself as its future in the EU. And never more important than now, we're talking about the world's leading economy and free world of democratic values. The EU is actually the core of democratic values. Statistically, only 20% of the world are democracies. And we tend to forget that because we live in democracies, so we assume surely we're in the majority, it's actually the minority. So when I saw this title just a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, not a few weeks ago, it was the early days of President Trump, and we kind of thought he was being sarcastic or he was going to change his views or whatever else. I don't think any one of us on this panel could have prepared for what's happened over the last 3 weeks, that short, sharp shot of rudeness and indignation towards Zelensky when he was in the White House. The kind of pressure put on, quite rightly in some cases, to increase the GDP of NATO, which has been debated for some time. This withdrawal of military intelligence and military hardware to Ukraine, which is part of the EU, part of Europe, sorry, and Europe needs to step up to that. What I'm pleased to say is that the Prime Minister of the UK has actively gone out and engaged and has created the coalition of the willing. All I would say is, if we'd been part of the EU, that might have been quicker and more easier to build those relationships. So I say here a bit perplexed because I'm on the outside wishing I was on the inside of the EU, but at the same time maybe it's given some hope for that, building back the resilience and those relationships, which will then inevitably lead to trust and better decision making. So I think my question really at the end of this is that from this meeting today, all of us go home and think about how do we build that trust, how do we build better relationships, and actually for those of us on the outside who voted in 2016, many will understand and have argued that there's Russian interference in order to help that to happen. We need to go back to ask that question of our own constituents about how do we get back involved in the EU, because now would be the time, quite frankly. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our final speaker, I'm grateful to say, has traveled, I think, the farthest from all of us, all the way from New York, to be with us.
I was in Baku 2 days ago.
Okay, good. So not so far, but based in New York. He is the representative of the United Nations and Committee of Nobel Peace Prize laureates, fellow trustee of the World Academy of Art and Science, and president of the Global Security Institute. Please join me in a very warm welcome for Mr. Jonathan Granoff. Good, take a good chair.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Just take this off. No, it's okay. No, it's not going to work. You got to move it.
Sorry. Okay.
So the modern state was created here in Europe. It was created because there were narratives and visions of what it was to be human and find meaning in life. These narratives were so passionate in the 17th century that people were willing to die for them. In fact, they weren't going to stop killing each other until a bunch of people like us, thoughtful people who didn't like the killing, said, let's figure out how to separate them. So in 1648, the modern state was created here in Europe, in Westphalia, because it was a problem of trying to separate people. But today's problems that we face, the multi-crisis of pandemics, the phytoplankton being our third lung, 60% of our oxygen comes from the health of the oceans. If any of us lose a lung, we can live. But if we lose the third lung, which is providing oxygen for every sentient being on the planet, we all die. The rainforests, the climate, none of these issues can be addressed at a national level. They have no military solution whatsoever. No matter how much money you spend on military hardware, you're not going to... Pandemics are not intimidated by weapons. And the stability of the climate, similarly, doesn't recognize passports. So we have a collective problem, and the institutions we have were not designed to address it. And there was 500 years of violence in Europe that continued even after Westphalia, over other narratives, national narratives, political ideologies. But that ended with the European Union. It's inconceivable now that Berlin and London would be enemies. So Europe is a really good example of rapid, one-generation progress of moving from massive bloodshed to the benefits of human security. Not the security only of the state, but the security of the people in the state. Security from fear, security from want, security from indignity. That's called human security. So right now, we have three major powers in the world: Russia, China, and the United States, that seem to be placing one of the elements of human security on the back burner: accountability and the rule of law. Now, my country, the United States, was until very recently a passionate champion of those values. But you can't count on us now. You can't count on us. We're in a state of turmoil like much of the world. And in China, there's no tradition of the rule of law. There's the rule through law. In Russia, it's the same way. I can remember being asked to advise the Civic Chamber, which is part of the Duma, that gives licenses for civic organizations in Moscow in 2012. And the head of it asked, how do you ensure in the United States that civil society is of benefit to the security of the state? Just think about that. Because I was thinking about it, and I said, I have no idea. But if you ask me, how do we ensure that the state is of benefit to civil society, I have a lot to say. Because in that model, and which is the model of Europe, the state is the employee, and the people are the employer. So, just step back a minute. When there's turmoil, you need a power of ought. You need a vision of where you want to go to. I would propose that the vision for today needs to have elements such as consistency with scientific truth in relationship to the natural world. You can't deny climate change and have a sustainable future, right? Also, the significance and importance of the dignity and value of every individual human life. You can't have multiple levels of justice. All of us have to be equal under the law, including the state. There's other elements of shared values and human rights that constitute a human security agenda that's necessary, because we need to have a common agenda to deal with these common threats that affect every single human being. And in this time of turmoil, we need coalitions based on those shared values. Is it likely that a coalition presently led by the United States could form a coalition of the willing based on those values with the current administration in my country? Is it likely? Is it likely that Russia can do this? Is it likely that China can do this? Is it likely that a coalition arising from the African Union would be based on those values and those traditions, and an understanding of the catastrophe when a major country gets out of line? Very sensitive here in Germany. Is it likely that Latin America will be able to put that vision of what ought to be in front of the world? I don't think so. Is it natural that Europe would do that?
Yes.
Given its history, given its values, given its depth of experience in the various foreign ministries, given the fact that the business community in Europe is fully integrated? Absolutely. So for Europe to come together based on human security values, based on fundamental freedoms, is not just for Europe. It's for the whole planet. And there's really no alternative for any other group to immediately step up. And indeed, those values were compromised in Brexit by the intervention, the intentional intervention of selfish techies with Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, and the Russians. These distortions are out of sync with the heart of the people. And I believe, from my experience, this is true everywhere in the modern world. Every educated person with common sense knows that we have a global multi-crisis that requires multilateralism, cooperative security. So I think that the subject here of European leadership is extremely, extremely important. Now, I just want to end with a personal example of experience, because experience is really important. There's a UN convention on anti-corruption. And pursuant to that, there's an institute that has permanent observer status in the General Assembly. So it's like, permanent observer status means you can participate in the general debates, but you don't vote like a nation, like the Vatican, right? So I had the diplomatic posting, and I was representing that institute in the creation of the SDG statement that the heads of state signed last year. And the Japanese put forward the proposition that the Sustainable Development Goals should be referenced as a human security agenda, which they are. They are. They're about how people live. How we all live, how everybody lives. And the Russian delegation said, we will break consensus over this. We will not allow the term human security in the document. So if you look at the SDG statement, you won't see human security, even though there is a human security trust in the UN system. And even though in 2012 there was a consensus document extolling the virtues of human security. But the Russians said, well, that's in 2012, remember. The Russians said, we'll break consensus. So I went over to them and said, are you for the counterfactual, human insecurity? And they were kind of taken aback, because everybody's very polite there, you know. They don't want to generate any extra conflict, as if the conflict can be avoided. So the team that was there, they didn't have an answer. I said, I'll come back tomorrow. Tell me what the issue is. So the next day they came back, and I said, why are you so against human security all of a sudden? And they said, we are concerned that the doctrine of human security could be used as a precursor for the invocation of responsibility to protect and breach our sovereignty. That's exactly the doctrine that was used by Russia to invade Ukraine. And that's exactly the issue of why China is calling human rights sovereign human rights, which means that the rights are really not rights, they're licenses of the sovereign. They either come from the dignity of the individual, which is something that the European population understands. The rights are inherent in your person, or they come from the state. And if they come from the state, they're licenses. And autocrats over time tend to conclude they get there by promising protecting the property rights of the rich, famous, and powerful. But when they get the power, all rights become licenses, including property rights, including your property rights as an entrepreneur. So we're at a cusp now in which our choice is loving things or loving people. Nations are things that we create. They're things. We create them as tools to address problems. But the inherent dignity of the person is sacred. And it's worth fighting for. And Europeans, from their experience and their history, understand this value that is not being understood appropriately in my country. So as an American, which from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN wouldn't have happened without my country. But now, since we're not carrying the ball, Europe had better step up for all of us. And I have faith that you will. Thank you.